Welcome everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Jenny Irons. I'm a Senior Program Officer at the William T. Grant Foundation. And today I'll be providing an overview of our funding program for reducing inequality research grants and provide some insights into what we look for and how we evaluate applications. This is an overview of what we'll cover in the webinar today. The webinar is organized into two parts, so we have time for questions about the first half of our content, and then we'll take questions at the end again about the entirety of the content. We appreciate you submitting your questions in advance. Some of those will be covered in the content of today's webinar, and Adam Gamoran, our president, will share some of those questions during the Q&A portions of our webinar. We are also welcome to submit questions throughout in the question and answer function that you should see on your screen, and we'll take questions again halfway through the webinar and at the end. I also want to let you know that the slides from today's webinar will be available and posted in the coming days on our website. Or actually, I should say the webinar itself will be posted in the coming days on our website, so please do look for that. All right, so let's get started. In the first half of the webinar, what I'm going to do is talk about our interest in funding research on reducing inequality. And in the second half of our webinar, I'll dig into the application and review process. So that's how the webinar is organized, and we'll start by tackling why our foundation is interested in funding work on reducing inequality for young people. The William T. Grant Foundation was founded in 1936 by William T. Grant, who was the owner of a chain of five and dime stores. And since its founding, the goal of the William T. Grant Foundation has been to use rigorous research to better understand human behavior. Our current goal is to fund high-quality research that is relevant to improving outcomes for youth ages 5 to 25 in the United States. In pursuit of this goal, we invest our research dollars in two main focus areas. Our Reducing Inequality initiative supports studies about ways programs, policies, and practices can reduce inequality and outcomes among young people in the United States. Our Use of Research Evidence initiative supports studies on strategies to improve the use of research evidence and policies in practice in ways that benefit young people. And I do want to let you all know that my colleagues Anu and Kim will be hosting a webinar on this focus area of our grant spending on Friday at noon. So please do join them for that. We have three main grant programs in our foundation. I'm going to be focusing on our major research grants and officers research grants today, but you may also be interested in learning more about our William T. Grant Scholars Award or Institutional Challenge Grant Program. And you can find information about these things on our website. And as I noted, I'll be talking about our focus area interested in research on reducing inequality, and my colleagues on Friday will be sharing information about our research on research use. Why are we interested in research on reducing inequality? Okay, there we go. The Reducing Inequality initiative was launched in 2014 after Adam Gamoran joined our foundation as president. We have three reasons we cite as the basis for this initiative. One is that inequality is pervasive in the United States, particularly by economic, racial, ethnic, and immigrant origin. Two, we have a lot of evidence about the nature and sources of inequality and about the consequences of inequality. The ways to reduce and address inequality are less well understood. So our goal is to support studies that focus on programs, policies, and practices to reduce inequality for young people. Let me just emphasize and underscore this key point. The defining feature of this initiative is that it focuses on responses to inequality, not its causes or consequences. So one way you can think about this in preparing a letter of inquiry is that the starting point for your research could be the documentation about the contours and consequences of inequality, but what you would focus on in your research funded by our foundation are ways to address that inequality. How do we address that inequality? How do we reduce inequality? In our research grants program, we support studies that build, test, or improve programs, policies, and practices to reduce inequality in academic, behavioral, economic, or social outcomes among young people in the United States. Our expectation is also that studies will build theoretical, empirical evidence on reducing inequality. We are primarily interested in efforts to reduce inequality on the basis of economic standing, race, ethnicity, and immigrant origin. We are also interested in work that examines strategies to reduce inequalities for LGBTQ youth. Now, you should note that we do sometimes fund work that is focused on other dimensions of inequality. So, for example, on disability. And what you would want to do in your LOI is make a strong case for why outcomes are unequal and how your study might address those unequal outcomes. We're particularly interested in studies as well that examine the ways in which these identities and group statuses intersect. When we review letters of inquiry internally, and again, I'll talk a little bit about that review process in a minute, one of the first things we look for is whether or not the proposed study is our fit with our research interests. We talk a lot about fit and whether or not studies fit with our interest in reducing inequality. Let me just say a few things about what that means. And this is just simply repeating some of the things I've told you already. One, we're interested in whether the dimension of inequality, and so again, that's race, ethnicity, economic standing, immigrant origin, is clear. Are you naming that? And are you making a case about how outcomes are unequal? So that's one, about the dimension of inequality. Two, we're also looking at whether or not the LOI or the letter of inquiry is identifying a leverage point or a program, policy, or practice that can reduce inequality. Or perhaps the study is going to explains very clearly how it will build that. What we would not fund is an application that comes in that's just saying, I'm going to essentially try to understand inequality, and eventually we'll get to building a response to that. We really want your studies to center that response. The third thing we look for is whether or not the letter of inquiry links that leverage point, that program, policy, or practice to the dimensions of inequality. So in other words, are you making a strong case that a program, policy, or practice is promising to actually target and reduce the inequalities that you're naming? And then finally, we want to see that the letter of inquiry identifies how a study will operationalize reducing inequality. How are you going to know whether or not, or how perhaps inequality might be reduced? Are you going to identify favorable youth outcomes? Are you going to look at indicators of success? Here's one thing you could do to think about whether or not your work is a fit with our interest in reducing inequality. You can use this sentence. And the way you might want to think about this is, can you take the work that you're doing, plug it into the blanks? Our communications folks call this our Mad Lib slide, which I think is pretty funny. But plug in your work. Can you describe your work in this sentence to indicate how your work is going to address a particular dimension of inequality? For example, this project tests whether a prosecutorial intervention reduces inequalities in incarceration rates for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous youth compared to white youth. So you see here, the sentence is naming a specific program, prosecutorial intervention, is looking at outcomes, incarceration rates, naming the particular youth it's focused on, and signaling that it's going to look at whether or not rates are reduced compared to another group. So in this case, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous youth who are disproportionately incarcerated compared to white youth. It's looking at whether a program intervention would reduce that inequality. Another example, which would be a more descriptive study, is that a project would explore the mechanisms by which civic engagement, so a program or practice, reduces inequalities in mental health outcomes for LGBTQ youth. So in this case, you're really looking at a process, the how, the why, that something might help improve outcomes for youth. Another thing I wanted to raise is that sometimes applicants ask us, do I have to directly measure youth outcomes? No, you don't have to do this, but only when there's a strong empirical or theoretical argument to be made for why a given program, policy, or practice is expected to lead to improved youth outcomes. Most of the studies we fund, however, do get to the point of thinking about youth outcomes, whether these are descriptive or intervention studies. So for example, you could propose to study a teacher professional development program that the literature very strongly establishes is likely to lead to reduced disciplinary disparities for young people. But you really do want to establish that in your literature review and a letter of inquiry, that whatever you're studying is likely to lead to improved youth outcomes in the long run, but for right now, you're just focusing on one component of that process. True or false? Would we fund a study, a letter of inquiry that comes in that says the project is focused on vulnerable youth, at-risk youth, at-promise youth, disadvantaged youth, or just youth in general? No, we likely would not, because again, remember, what we want to see is that you're specifying the dimension or dimensions of inequality that you're interested in, because that's really important for thinking about whether or not the program, policy, or practices you're examining are actually going to reduce that inequality. So please do be very clear about this. Again, I'm just saying this is not a fit. These all-encompassing terms are too vague, and we want you to be very specific. Do we fund work that is about documenting the extent or impact of inequality? No, while this work is very important to the social sciences, it's not a fit with our research interest. We fund work that is focused and that centers reducing inequality. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the types of studies we fund. I'm going to give you a broad overview of the different approaches to work that we fund, and then highlight some funded studies to give you a sense of the range of work that we fund at the William T. Grant Foundation. In this Reducing Inequality initiative, we fund descriptive studies that clarify the mechanisms for reducing inequality. So again, the kinds of studies that dig into the how, the why, the processes. And this could be qualitative studies or quantitative studies that are correlational, so that cannot judge cause and effect, for example. We also fund intervention studies that examine attempts to reduce inequalities and use methods that support claims about cause and effect. So for example, a lot of our program evaluation studies use random control designs. They sometimes also use quasi-experimental designs. Our policy intervention studies that we fund are natural experiment studies, often use quasi-experimental designs, or can take advantage of a natural experiment that approximates random assignment. So again, these are studies that can judge cause and effect. And I know that one of the questions we got is, what mistake do we often see applicants make? And I would just encourage applicants to be very clear about the kinds of claims that you can make with applications you submit. So for example, if you're doing correlational analyses, then you cannot judge cause and effects. We encourage you to avoid language that claims that you can, or that says that you're looking at impact, for example. We also occasionally fund measurement studies that are developing measures to enhance the work of researchers, policymakers, and practitioners who are focused on reducing inequalities for young people. And occasionally, although it's not on this slide, we also fund meta-analysis studies as well that will make strong contributions to the literature. So let me unpack this a little bit more by giving you some examples of studies we've actually funded to give you a sense of the range of methodological work we support and the range of youth serving systems in which we fund. And I just do want to underscore that we are open to funding a range of approaches: qualitative studies, quantitative studies, mixed method studies. What's important for us is that the questions you're asking are relevant to our interest in reducing inequality, and that the research design you're proposing to answer those questions is aligned with the questions you're asking. So here, I'm going to give you 4 examples of studies we funded that are descriptive in nature. So one study we funded is led by Rachel Feldman at NORC, and it uses interviews, observations, and document analysis to examine the role of a facilitated collaborative in fostering racial equity and racial equity plans in colleges throughout the state, college 2- and 4-year institutions throughout the state of Illinois. So they're really digging into how administrators are thinking and talking about race and ethnicity as they implement racial equity plans. So very much a deep qualitative study. We've also funded Edna Tan at UNC Greensboro, who's conducting a design-based implementation research study with established research practice partnerships in Michigan and North Carolina to engage families in developing an asset-based approach to STEM education that values the traditions and experiences of families of color. So we fund a lot of work that is using these kinds of design-based or engaged approaches to answer important questions about better serving youth and their families. We also recently funded Brianna Woods-Jaeger at Emory University, who's working with her team across 3 cities to explore how Black youth experience an intervention. So it's not testing an intervention, but really looking at how youth experience an intervention that is intended to help them address racial trauma and promote improved mental health outcomes. Finally, this is an example of a study which is quantitative but descriptive. So in this study we funded, Kathleen Powell is looking at how young adults experience marijuana legalization and reform in New Jersey. So she and her team are conducting a statewide survey and interview, so looking both using linear regression to look at how reforms are associated with outcomes for different racial and ethnic groups, but also using interviews to explore how these reforms are experienced in more depth. These now, I'm turning to examples of program intervention studies. So these are examples where people are using methods that can judge cause and effect to examine whether or not an intervention is effective in reducing particular youth inequalities. One study we funded recently is by Katie Edwards, and what she's doing is taking an intervention that has already shown promise in improving outcomes for sexual and gender minority youth of color and transforming it into an online intervention. So she and her team are going to refine an intervention for online delivery and then recruit and randomly assign youth and their families between the ages of 14 and 18 to a treatment or waitlist control group. So they're using experimental design to examine an intervention. Another example of a study we funded in this space is led by Matt Kraft, and he's looking at grow your own programs, which are intended to increase teacher racial and ethnic diversity. He and his colleague will evaluate the impact of an existing grow your own program in Texas on teacher recruitment, retention, and effectiveness, and will use quasi-experimental designs, including regression discontinuity and difference models to examine the impact of these grow your own programs. Another example of a program intervention study is led by Adriana Villavicencio, and she's working with her colleagues to conduct a mixed method study that will include both a qualitative implementation study that uses interviews, focus groups, and a quantitative impact study that uses propensity score matching to examine the effectiveness of international academies or the embedding of special instruction for English learners within schools. Finally, I want to highlight another study we funded recently by Gail Ferguson. In this case, Dr. Ferguson is building on a pilot study and will be using an experimental design to test the relative effectiveness of an intervention that examines, that seeks to improve mothers' communication about race, white mothers' communication about race with their children, to see if they can help white mothers develop greater racial awareness and reduce racism and racial bias in their children. So let me turn now to giving you some examples. Oh, look at that, I just used my mouse in the wrong way. Let me turn now to giving you some examples of policy intervention studies, which are often taking advantage of national experiments to examine the effectiveness of policies at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level in reducing inequalities for young people. One study we funded recently is led by Jeremy Borofsky, and this study is going to leverage a natural experiment that was created during the COVID-19 pandemic as states varied in how and when they relaxed administrative burdens. So this team will use a difference in difference model to estimate the effects of changing administrative burden policies on benefit enrollment and child poverty, and is especially going to look at how differences vary or effects vary for Black and Latinx children. Anna Rhodes and her colleagues, in partnership with the Houston Housing Authority, are conducting an intent to treat estimate and examination of voucher effects. So they're looking at how voucher receipt improves academic outcomes for students from low-income families. Zhu at the American Institutes for Research is going to use a regression discontinuity design to examine the outcomes of a state policy on reducing inequalities in community colleges. And then finally, Randall Akey and his team are using difference in different models to analyze outcomes for American Indian young adults whose households received casino transfers. So they're really trying to dig into whether or not tribal cash transfers can reduce the intergenerational transmission of poverty. So they're building a data set but relying on secondary data and using quasi-experimental designs to answer their question. So a lot of different examples here that I've given you of funded studies that are using different approaches. You can search our grants database on our website to find a range of the types of studies we fund that should give you a sense of the questions we're interested in people asking, and also the wide range of methodological approaches we support. Finally, I just want to draw attention to one example of a measurement development study we funded. Deborah Rivas Drake had a major grant with us where one of the things she was interested in further exploring was a measure of equity-based social emotional learning practices. So she applied for a small officers research grant from us to get additional funding to develop a tool that could be used by researchers to really better understand how teachers advance and support racial equity in their instruction on social emotional learning. I just saw Debbie at a conference, and she was excited to say that a publication is forthcoming soon about this work, so do be on the lookout for that. So I have talked a lot at this point, and so we'll pause here for questions I've covered so far. Keep in mind that the second half of this conversation, we're going to focus on the application and review process. So hold your questions on that. But thus far, if you have any questions about what we're interested in funding, happy to take them, and I'm sure Adam's eager to jump in and get a conversation going about your good questions.
Yes, Jenny, thank you for that great informative talk so far. And we have some questions that have come into the question box, some of which I've been able to answer and some of which I've held for you to answer. We also got a number of questions in advance, and I'm so pleased that you were able to address many of them already. But there's a few that I think you could elaborate on, so I'm going to start with those. In your remarks, you gave many examples of successful grants. What resources do we have on our website for potential applicants to learn more about the grants that we funded?
Thanks, Adam. We have a lot of resources on our website, and one thing I do when I give talks about our funding is encourage people to review all of the great resources that are provided. One of the most important resources we provide is we have excerpts of proposals that we have annotated on our website. You can find these on our resources page across all of our grant programs. Currently working on some for the Institutional Challenge Grant, but we do have these available for major research grants. So if you go to the resources page on our website, you will see that we have a couple of proposals annotated. And what we do with these annotations is really try to highlight for you how people in their proposal narratives are meeting the things that we ask them to address. So again, the things that are annotated are proposals. They're not letters of inquiry, but they should still give you a good sense of how people are asking questions, what kinds of things we're looking for. So we do hope that you take advantage of those resources.
Thanks, Jenny. And could reducing inequality in mental health services be a viable topic for a proposal?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned in the webinar, we're interested in work that addresses inequalities across a range of youth-serving systems. Certainly, mental health is a critical issue for scholars who study youth to be thinking about right now. We have a wonderful piece available on our resources page written by Maggie Alegria, a wonderful researcher in the mental health space who also helps us out with our review of proposals. I encourage you to look at her piece. We've also funded a number of studies in this space. I mentioned Brianna Woods-Shager's work. We've also funded Pamela Morris-Perez, who's doing a study of suicide interventions for LGBTQ youth and Latinx youth. But absolutely, we encourage you to submit studies that are examining that, and certainly you might look at various dimensions of inequality in the mental health services space.
Great. And this is something that you touched on in your remarks, but I thought you might want to elaborate. The questioner has asked, are you interested more in quantitative studies or qualitative studies, more in secondary data or in original data analyses?
We are agnostic about that. Again, what's really important for us is that you're answering important questions about ways to reduce inequality for young people, and that those methods are aligned with the questions you're asking. I think, in most of our dockets, when we recommend funding, we're funding quantitative work, qualitative work, mixed methods work. We are field initiated. We fund the good work that comes into us. We hope our review process, helps that really great studies rise to the top, but we're interested in funding really great research on really important questions. And you can see just by searching our database, the range of work that we fund. I will note in this, we'll get in a minute to the application process and budget, but usually secondary studies that are relying primarily on secondary data or solely on secondary data are the lower end of our budget range, so $300,000 to $400,000, while the studies that are collecting original data are more complex, or at the higher end of our budget range, so towards $600,000.
Thanks, Jenny. There was one other advanced question that I thought I would respond to.
Great.
And this is the important question about how has the pushback on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives from state legislatures impacted your decision making? And we are certainly aware of pushback against efforts to advance racial equity. And yet, the focus of the William T. Grant Foundation's Reducing Inequality initiative is on reducing inequality in youth outcomes. So I would say that the pushback from state legislators has not impacted our decision-making at all. What it has impacted is our commitment to being a voice for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and our desire to support our grantees in their efforts to advance research on reducing racial inequality as well as inequality by ethnic origin, by socioeconomic status or income, and by immigrant origins, language minority origins, and LGBTQ status. So I would say it has bolstered our resolve, but has not affected our decision making. Now let's take some of the questions that have come in while we've been speaking. And the first one I want to ask you about is whether we fund interventions that focus on parents that have downstream impacts on improving outcomes, or let's say reducing inequality for children. We get this question a lot. Are we interested in more proximate outcomes? Sometimes this questioner was asking about parents, sometimes it's about teachers, could also be about caseworkers. Are we funding research that focuses on more proximate outcomes, or must the study include outcomes for children and youth?
Oh, you're asking me that? I thought you were answering.
Yep.
Again, this is one where it depends on the questions you're asking and what can be answered in the time period of the grant. So these grants are 2 to 3 year grants. And it is true that a lot of what we fund, people are looking at youth outcomes, but we were also funding work where people are looking at the more, proximate or intermediary outcomes, but again, making a strong case based in the literature that if, you're seeing certain things change, like if you're seeing teacher behaviors change, or you're seeing other things change in the more proximate term than in the more long term, you're expected to see changes for youth as well.
Thanks,
Adam,
Jenny.
you want to add anything to that?
No, thanks. I'm going to move on because time is short. Can funds be used for program evaluation?
Yes, they can. But what we, as I mentioned during the webinar, we also want to see you make a case that the work you're doing will make a contribution to theoretical empirical literature. So it should be relevant beyond just the space of a particular program you're examining, and what, you need to be able to think about what the implications are for the literature on reducing inequality in your field, but also think about what others might learn from the study as well. So we want to see that it has value outside that particular program.
Thanks. And here's one I'll take myself, and you can correct me if I get it wrong. Are program officers available for conversations with potential grantees? Unfortunately, because we receive hundreds of letters of inquiry, we are not generally available for conversations. We do, in addition to webinars like today and campus visits, we do present at national conferences. It's often possible to track one of us down there. And in addition, we have coffee chats, which are more informal web-based experiences, which are explicitly designed for potential applicants to come and ask questions. So look out for those opportunities. Anything to add there, Jenny?
No, thanks, Adam. Yeah, we just hope that the many resources on our website are helpful for you.
Great. Are applicants who are not affiliated with universities less likely to be considered for funding?
No, certainly, and I'll mention this in a minute. We fund institutions, not individuals, and that can be any nonprofit organization. I think what is critical to think about is being able to conduct a rigorous research program for the grant, and also being able to support a large grant at your organization. So again, this is, when I'm asked this question, I often encourage people to look at the types of studies we fund and think about whether or not your work would be a good fit. Not just because if we funded X, we're necessarily going to fund something else, but it gives you a sense of the kind of work that we do support.
Jenny, there are a few questions about whether we fund research on reducing inequality in physical health, and I'm just going to jump in and say generally no. There's one question about populations with diseases, another questions about other physical health issues, and generally there are other funding sources, notably NIH, which funds research on physical health. So we mainly stick to academic, social, behavioral, and economic outcomes. We do support research that focuses on reducing inequality in mental health and mental health services, but generally not those that focus on physical health. Last one I'm going to take in this category, and then we'll let you conclude the webinar, and we'll have another period for all the questions we didn't get to. And that is, could you repeat the age range that we focus on, Jenny?
Sure, it's ages 5 to 25. Another thing to think about is that if you're looking at an intervention, for example, the intervention that you study should take place during that age range. So we would not fund a study, for example, where an intervention happens, say in preschool when kids are 3 to 4, and then you're looking at outcomes when they're older. The intervention does need to take place within that age range.
Great. Well, it's been good chatting with you, Jenny. I'm going to let you finish the webinar, and then I'll come back on camera when there's more questions at the end.
Thanks, Adam. All right, let's turn to the application and review process now. So I'm talking about the Major Grants Program today. In our Major Grants Program, we fund 2 types of grants. So sometimes I think this can be a little confusing for people. We fund our major research grants, which are our large grants. They range in budget from $100,000 to $600,000. Again, the $600,000 grants are the ones that are typically conducting RCTs, doing original data collection, etc., qualitative data collection included. But we do have our Officers Research Grants Program, which is grants $50,000 or less. Those do not require board approval, so they're typically made on a little bit faster time frame. I'll talk about time frame issues in a minute. But these Officer Research Grants are good for perhaps early stage work, early career researchers who are looking to get their feet wet in leading grants. As I mentioned, sometimes our major grant recipients apply for these grants to explore further things that they're learning in their larger grants projects, but we do especially encourage early career researchers to apply for these awards to do more exploratory or early stage work. Sometimes these awards are also good for smaller projects that use secondary data. So again, we have a lot of examples of awards we've given in this program that you can find on our website, but these are the 2 types of grants, 2 grant sizes that we give out in this grants program. So let me mention that we have an upcoming deadline right around the corner of May 1st. We'll be receiving letters of inquiry for our major grants only. So again, those are the larger grants of $100,000 to $600,000. And on August 7th, which is our 3rd and final deadline this year, we already had a deadline in January, we'll be receiving applications for both our Major Grants Program and our Officers Research Awards. And I'm going to tell you on our next slide about what you need to submit. And I just want to underscore while we're here, we give grants to institutions or organizations, not to individuals. We give grants to nonprofit organizations, not for-profit organizations. And the other thing I'll mention here, and probably again, is our funding is meant to support research and research-related activities. We don't give grants to support service delivery or programs. So what do you submit? Well, the main thing you submit, and the main thing I've been talking about today, is you submit a 5-page letter of inquiry. We call this the LOI. This is not an actual letter. It is a mini proposal. If you address it as a letter, we don't count that against you, but really all you need to do is write a 5-page mini proposal that describes the work that you're undertaking. And again, we have very clear guidelines about what we're looking for in that LOI on our website. You also submit some project description information, and when you go into our grants management system, Smart Simple, you'll learn about the kinds of information you submit there. When you apply for a major research grant, you submit the budget amount. You do not submit any budget materials, but you do need to include a budget amount. You also include a one-page CV or resume or bio sketch for the personnel who will be part of this grant. And I do want to note, if you're applying for an Officers Research Award, which are called the smaller awards of $50,000 or less, then you do actually include your budget materials. And this is important to think about because those budget materials, by the way, are online. They include a template where you're filling in budget categories, and then you're also including a budget justification form. And this is important because you'll need to plan with your sponsored projects office about getting institutional approval for that budget, because that is a step in the process that you need to complete before you finish your application. So again, that's true only at this stage if you're applying for an Officers Research Award, not a major grant. All the budget stuff comes only if you're invited to submit a full proposal. More on that in a minute. Again, the budget that you submit should support research, not program costs. Note that we have an indirect cost rate of up to 15%. There's information about this in all of our application materials and online. Again, for the OR Officers Research Award applications, do plan to get your institutional approval for budgets. Thinking back to the previous slide, our deadlines are 3 p.m. on the days that applications are due, and you want to have all that stuff taken care of before then. Our portal or the application process opens up a few months before the applications are due, so you should have plenty of time to work on that. And finally, I've bolded this last thing here because I really encourage you to be best friends with our application guidance. Read it really closely, get a good sense of what we're looking for. Let me talk a little bit now about the review process. We do the best we can to try to make our review process really transparent for our applicants because we think that is the right and the fair thing to do. This is a very busy slide, I know, and really what all we're talking about today is the part that you're seeing on the left-hand side, the LOI review process. As Adam mentioned, we get hundreds of LOIs at each of our deadlines, so it is a busy time for us. When we receive the letters of inquiry, they are reviewed twice by 2 different members of our program staff. So each letter of inquiry gets read twice. And we're reviewing those letters of inquiry for whether or not they're a fit with our interest. Is the research design aligned with the questions being asked? All the things I told you about in the first half of this webinar. After those reviews come in, and that process takes about 6 to 8 weeks for us to review all of the LOIs that come in. Then we have a meeting where we deliberate on the 2 different reviews and make decisions about which letters of inquiry to decline and which applicants we're going to invite to submit a full proposal. Now, let me just say quickly that for Officers Research Awards, the only thing that happens in the review process is what you see on the left-hand side. We either decide to decline the application or our entire senior program team reviews the application to make a decision about whether or not to fund. So, but really I'm talking here about applications for major research grants. We invite roughly 15 to 18% of letters of inquiry that we receive to be submitted as a full proposal. So if you're invited to submit a full proposal, you get an invitation from us to submit a full proposal, and you're asked to choose between 2 dates. So for example, for folks who submitted in January, they were asked to choose whether or not they would submit their full proposal in April or September. If you're submitting a full proposal in May, you'll be asked whether or not you want to submit your full proposal by a September deadline or November deadline. And depending on which deadline you choose, the timeline from when you submit a letter of inquiry to potentially getting funding is anywhere from 10 to 15 months, just because of how the process unfolds. Very quickly, I'll say what happens when the full proposal comes in. Program staff identify potential reviewers who can address the subject matter in your proposal, but also the methods that you're using. Ideally, we want each person to be able to address both of those things. In our Reducing Inequality initiative, you're reviewed by at least 2 peer reviewers, sometimes 3. Those reviewers send their reviews back to us, and then we make decisions at that stage about which proposals are declined and which proposals advance to review by our senior staff. So at the next stage, if proposal is favorably reviewed by external reviewers, then our senior staff, who all have PhDs and different kinds of expertise, review those proposals and the reviews, and then we make another round of decisions about which proposals to decline and which applicants are invited to respond to concerns. And at that stage, when those responses come back, our senior program team again deliberates, a lot of deliberation here, about which proposals we'll be recommending to our board for funding. So it is a rigorous review process, and we really do, make an effort to only advance work that we think will be successful in our review process. And I'll tell you as well that when we invite full proposals in, we end up funding roughly 20 to 30% of those ultimately. So let me talk a little bit now about what a strong letter of inquiry looks like. You should have gotten a sense of that in the first half of the webinar, but let me call that out in some different ways. One, this should be obvious. A strong letter of inquiry is a fit with our interest in reducing inequality. It also situates the project in a well-developed and integrated literature review. This is the kind of language I used to use with my students when I taught at a liberal arts college, but the rule applies for everyone, right? And I'm drawing attention to this in particular because this is one of the questions we received from someone who was interested in joining the webinar. They asked, what does a good literature review look like? Now, in a 5-page letter of inquiry, you don't have much space to spend on your literature review, because I would say at least 2.5 to 3 pages really need to be laying out your strong research design. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But a well-developed integrated literature review is really drawing on the literature in a cohesive way, both to clarify the youth populations you're interested in. What are those dimensions of inequality? How are the outcomes are unequal? You've got to make a case that outcomes are unequal and there's a need to address this particular inequality. 2, literature review is important for establishing the theoretical and empirical relevance of your work and how you're going to add to that. And 3, a literature review is important for laying that foundation for how or why the program, policy, or practice you're examining or creating is expected to address that inequality. So again, one of the things we look for is, does it make sense that the program, policy, or practice you're examining will actually address the inequality that you're interested in? Another thing a good LOI should do is show reviewers the project's relevance. So one of the things we're asking ourselves is, are we seeing a strong case made that what this applicant is examining could potentially show up or be implemented in the youth serving system? So not everything we fund is applicants or researchers working in partnership with a school district or a child welfare agency, for example. Some of the folks we fund are doing that and are working in partnership to try to change policy or practice. Not everybody is doing that. In fact, most of the research studies we fund aren't doing that. But we want to see a way in which the work you're doing could potentially be implemented in a youth serving system. So you want to take up some space to make that case in your LOI. There we go. Again, another thing we want to see is that the research design you're proposing, the methods you're using, the analyses you're conducting map tightly to the research questions you're asking or your hypotheses. So that needs to be really clear, which is why you want to spend a good chunk of your LOI talking about your research design, because we need sufficient information that reviewers have confidence that you're going to have rigor in your methods, again, quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, and that the methods are appropriate to answer the questions being asked. Finally, we also like to see, not finally, I think I have one more thing to say here. We also want to see that you're demonstrating an understanding of the strengths and limitations of the design methods and analyses. So if there's a weakness in the data or if there's a limitation of your analyses, briefly name it and say how you're going to address it. That's a really important thing to do. And finally, we want you to avoid jargon as much as possible. I have a PhD in sociology. Sociology is full of jargon, most disciplines are. But use language that conveys to PhD level readers what you're doing and why it's important. And again, to the extent that you can, try to avoid that very discipline specific jargon. I want to draw attention now as we wrap up this portion and turn to your questions, that we have a lot of great resources on our website. We have our research grants application guide, submission instructions, lots of papers and essays that staff have written, that our grantees have written to help you think about what's important to, what are some of the important things to think about for research on reducing inequality. We have our really wonderful FAQ page where a lot of the questions you have are answered because so many people have asked them before. And again, we have webinar recording and slides. This webinar will be available. We have other webinars that we've done in the past that focus on specific themes. You can find those resources there. And I just also want to mention that across all of our grant programs, we strive in a very intentional way to support a diverse group of researchers in terms of race and ethnicity, gender, seniority, and we encourage research projects, especially that are led by Black, African American, Latinx, Native American, and Asian Pacific American researchers. Most of the studies we fund in our major grants program are composed of teams of multiple researchers. I just want to mention that. Often conducting a major a study that would be funded in our major grants program would be difficult, for, if not impossible, for one person to do alone. So get together with your colleagues. And especially if you're working with a multidisciplinary team, I think that's the, that can be quite important. A lot of the work we fund is mixed methods, and one thing I do want to flag there is like mixed methods take time to address how the work that you're doing will be integrated to answer the important and sometimes complex questions that you're asking. Finally, I just want to underscore resubmissions are welcome. We don't have a limit in the number of times you can apply to the foundation. You might be declined at the letter of inquiry stage, but you're welcome to apply again. You might submit an application in January that's declined. You can submit it again in August. We do not have restrictions on the number of times you can submit to us. So please do take any kind of feedback you receive, whether it's general or custom, to revise your work and submit it here or to someone else, because we certainly do hope that the feedback you get from us might help you in strengthening your project, no matter where you submit it and where you get funded. So I will stop talking now and take your questions. Good luck with your applications. And before we turn to questions, I just also do want to remind you, for those of you who are interested in our portfolio that examines ways to improve the use of research evidence, there's another webinar this Friday that my colleagues Anu Sidhu and Kim Dumont will be leading, and I encourage you to join that at noon on Friday. So Adam, let's turn to those questions again.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks for the commercial about Friday's webinar. Look forward to seeing people again there. And from today, we've had a number of questions from the advanced questions that I held on to for now, and then also some new questions that have come up. I'm going to start with a couple of the new questions that were prompted by your remarks. Could you go over the timeline of when people hear decisions based on submissions of letters of inquiry? Specifically, someone's wondering that if they submit a May LOI, will they hear by July so they can make a decision by August? And then others are asking about, could you say again when the Officers Research Awards are available?
Yes, thanks, Adam. So short answer to the question, yes, you'll hear by July. The applications come in May 1st. Again, it takes us roughly 6 to 8 weeks to get through that review process, and then it takes a little bit of time to get the letters ready to go out. And then, just as an aside, we also have other things happening like board meetings and grantee convenings, so sometimes that slows us down a little bit. But that said, it's really important as to get responses back to you in a timely manner. We know that your decision hinges on that. So we try to get invitations to submit a full proposal out as soon as possible, because we know some people who submit in May are going to be aiming to get a full proposal in by September. But even for those of you who may submit a letter of inquiry in May and are declined, our goal is to get those decision letters out in early July. So you could perhaps address any feedback, turn that around, and submit it by the August 7th deadline. Now, in terms of our deadlines, we have 3 deadlines a year for this program: January, May, and August. Officers' research grant applications are only accepted in January and August. So if you're planning to submit for one of those smaller grants, this year you can only submit in August. Our deadline is August 7th. You cannot submit in May. So you could submit in August or in January.
Thanks, Jenny. Are
Yep.
international researchers eligible to apply for these grants?
You are eligible to apply, but again, because of our foundation's mission and goals, we're focused on funding work on youth in the United States, ages 5 to 25, but certainly you can be at any institution that is a nonprofit anywhere in the world to apply for our funding, but the work does need to be focused on youth in the United States.
And what's the biggest distinction as to why a PI would apply for a major research grant versus an officer's research award?
Yeah, the distinction really is about the scope of the work. The projects that the major research grants are taking on are 2 to 3 year projects that are quite extensive, whether they're looking at secondary data and analyses or whether they're larger longitudinal qualitative studies or randomized controls trials. And the officers' research awards are $50,000 or less. So they really are usually, you might think of it as looking at a smaller chunk of a larger project, or again, doing more exploratory work. Perhaps you want to do a randomized control trial, but you need to do some pilot work to get started. And so a smaller grant is something that might enable you to do that.
Thanks. Jenny, in the past few months, what were some of the most frequent mistakes that applicants make in interpreting the guidelines?
I would say, I talked earlier in my slide when I was saying the things we look for and we're looking for whether or not something's a fit. The most common reason why research isn't a fit with our interests is that it's just really not focused on reducing inequality. So it's focused on describing inequality, explaining inequality, documenting the consequences of inequality, but the central focus of the work is not on reducing or responding to inequality. So that's like one thing we see. Another thing we see, which I try to flag in those Mad Libs, not a fit slide, is that if you apply to us and you're just saying, I want to study youth and whether inequality is reduced from youth, we're not going to support that because we really want to see what groups of youth are you focused on. And then another thing we see, not that often, because usually people are pretty good about this, is that people are applying to get funding to support programs that they have, important programs, but we are a research funder, and that is not what we fund.
Thanks, Jenny. Those are some very helpful tips. Can an applicant apply for a grant from the William T. Grant Foundation if he or she already has another application under review at the foundation?
Yes.
Jenny, a one-page CV seems very limited to display all of my amazing accomplishments. What should I prioritize when presenting the one-page CV?
Adam, I have to say, this made me think maybe a resource we should provide would be you reducing your CV to one page to illustrate for people how to do that. But we want to see some, I would say, list a few publications, your most relevant publications to the work you're doing, right? It's also helpful to see, especially for the major research grants program, if you have had other grants, if you've been a co-PI on grants. So really try to emphasize or highlight the work that you've done that is most relevant to the work that you're proposing to do. That is what's really of critical importance.
Great. So positions, education, but then mostly the most important thing is to convey your accomplishments that are relevant to the work in the proposal.
Absolutely.
That seems like good advice. Okay, I'm focusing now on the one. Oh, here's a great question for our communications team. Could you please put in the chat the link to register for Friday's webinar? Thank you, communications team. Great question. How do we think about grants, the time span covered by the grants? For example, is there a preference for a 2-year versus a 3-year project?
Nope, there is not. It's really, and often a lot of the work we fund, even when people say they're going to do it in 2 years, we think, oh, there's no way they'll do this in 2 years. So there is no preference. You could do 2 years, 3 years. And again, with the budget, I would say ask for what you need to do the work and use that bus. If you're invited to submit a full proposal, use the budget justification narrative to justify why you're asking for what you're asking for. But no, we don't prioritize by requested budget or the time frame of the grant.
Thanks, Jenny. Here's a question that I think might be thinking of another one of our programs. This applicant is asking, or this potential applicant is asking whether more than one PI from the same institution can apply. And I'm going to jump in and say, you might be thinking of the William T. Grant Scholars Program, which does limit applications such that only one candidate may be nominated from each major division of an institution in a given year. So at a particular university, the law school could nominate someone, the College of Letters and Sciences could nominate someone, the School of Education could nominate someone, but only one candidate from each of those divisions per year. With respect to the major research grants, however, those limitations do not apply. A university can send us as many applications as they wish in a given year. Here's a question about mixed methods. You mentioned mixed methods. How do you think about legal research in thinking about mixed methods?
I assume this is about looking at the cases, like doing a document analysis of cases. Adam, is that what you think that would mean?
Yeah, I would say, you know, legal research is on the board. It has to be answering a question about reducing inequality in youth outcomes. Typically, we are focused on empirical social methods of empirical social science, but we have had legal research. For example, got some examples of that, right?
Well, I think about, like, I mean, this is a scholars project, but it's reducing inequality. Mark Katzenbuehler was looking at legal cases related to anti-bullying legislation in California, and again, different grant program, because part of his scholars program is about stretching your expertise, and he worked with a legal scholar to really try to understand how to code cases to think about anti-bullying and how that legislation was getting implemented in schools. So I know this is the URE initiative. There has been work that has done this kind of thing, but certainly, yeah, we'd be open to reducing inequality as well. We're probably not thinking of work we funded.
Can a postdoc be a PI or a co-PI? Yes, of course, you need the support of an institution because, as Jenny mentioned, grants are awarded not to individuals but to institutions. But if your institution is willing to put you up as a PI or a co-PI, we certainly have no barrier for that. One potential applicant is thinking of applying for both the major research grants and the officer's research grants at the same time. What advice would you have for that applicant?
People do that, and it's. I mean, again, we don't have limitations on the number of applications you can put in. I would just, again, it's really about the scope of the work. So for the Officers Research Award, just make sure you're proposing to do work that could be done with a $50,000 grant. So I would not submit the same exact application for both, because you want to tailor it to the type of award you're applying for.
Thanks. Well, Jenny, we were able to answer almost all of the questions. I'm just going to really take one more because we are just about out of time. Maybe I can answer a few of these. Okay, so one applicant is wondering about the track record of the applicant and how that's judged in reviewing grant proposals. The specific question is the number of previous publications important consideration for the grant? But let's broaden that out a bit and say, how do we look at the applicant's track record when thinking about the possibility of funding?
Yeah, I would say when we're thinking about this internally, or even if you're invited to submit a full proposal and your application goes out to reviewers, they're thinking about the feasibility of the project being conducted. So for a large project like a major research grant, it does often matter for reviewers that you have done work, you've published in that space. It's not a requirement, but it makes a difference for reviewers because they're likely to be more skeptical if you're doing work that is seemingly not in line either methodologically or in terms of content with what you've done before. So you would need to make a case for that somehow. And again, if you're applying for a major research grant, then often it's, you're the PI, but there are different team members you have that can cover different parts of the grant. And I would say the other thing that matters is the trust reviewers have, or the faith they have in your ability to run a large grant, to manage a large grant. Like, that's really important. That we fund early career researchers for major grants, but we want to see evidence or convincing evidence that they'll be able to lead a research team to conduct the kind of work they're asking to conduct. Adam?
Thanks very much, Jenny. I think that's really helpful. Well, our time has concluded, so I will let you sign off.
Thanks everyone for joining us. And again, look for announcements about coffee chats or other things that we do. And again, we hope our website will be helpful to you as you prepare your applications. Good luck.